So we're going to move on. So here's something interesting. So we haven't yet heard from Vraja, Lila, and Ekavira Prabhus. So, okay. The last category is reactivity and boundaries. That's an interesting topic because we're talking about trust here. So can you please tell us, esteemed Prabhus, how setting boundaries can actually help build trust in a relationship?
Jai. Hari Hari, thank you so much. I think that strategy, Yadana Prabhu, of getting on your knees, I love that. That's an amazing strategy. And that's a wonderful boundary also. So, there's some key distinctions that we would like to introduce for building trust. And one, first, we would want to ask, what is it that we already trust about our partner? Because, we get in these relationships and there are some things that we might trust or we do trust about them. So often when we think about trust, we just think there's no, how do you fix this? How do you make this right just the way I want it? In my imperfected sense, I want it to be perfect. And we forget, I'm imperfect. What is it that I'm trying to get here? So yeah, the first thing I always look at is what is it that I trust in my mate, in my partner? Because trust is contextual. Yeah, it's kind of everyone has a different experience of trust depending on, as Chintamani said, what we learn, in childhood, how we're brought up. And so some things I've thought about in terms of understanding trust is we may trust our partner around many things. For example, we may trust that our partner drives safely. This is one that I trust with my partner. we may trust that our partner take care of the maintenance of the home. I really do trust that with my partner. And, we may trust that our partner compassionately care for others. I really trust that in my partner. However, there are some things that we're still building trust, right? Because we're imperfect. And so, secondly, we want to ask what areas in our relationship we would like to build trust. How would we like to build more trust? And so for us, we are working on building trust around really listening to each other with attention and curiosity. We're really working on that. We're also really working on building trust in having open and honest communication. Open and honest communication, that means no gray areas. That means if it hurts, let's talk about it. That means if it makes me sad, it makes me disappointed, let's talk about it. Let's have open, honest communication. We're building trust on that one. We're also building trust on transparency with finances. I was brought up as a young person where my mother and my father had separate accounts. So for me, that's quite normal and quite natural. And so when I get in a relationship where the other person thinks we should put all our money together and we figure it out together, and so then that becomes a little bit of a problem. So we got to build trust in that area, serious trust. And so for us, that's been work, and we've been married 30 years. And so we're working on that. We can't say we fully trust each other in terms of our transparency with finances. I remember my mom used to buy things and she used to call me into the car and says, take it in and hide it from your father. And I would be like, what? So those are some of the ways I grew up, as a kid. So of course, now I'm in a relationship and my spouse expects that, he's supposed to know everything about my money. I'm like, wait, I don't know about that. So yes, or I think I'm supposed to know everything, every little cent that he spends or where, whatever, And we do have these conceptions of I, me, and mine, unfortunately. We are learning how to not have that because we have this amazing philosophy of Krishna consciousness. And so thirdly, once we have named the kind of trust that we want to build, once we've named it and we are aware of it, then we want to check in, with ourselves on how we may be blocking building the trust, or we're cultivating building the trust. So we are working on cultivating building the trust. And one of the tools that we use in our relationship to help us build trust is to set boundaries with each other. And so Ekavira Prabhu will help us with understanding this conception of boundaries.
Yes.
Hari Hari.
Haribo. Hare Krishna, everyone. I have to admit that this section is about boundaries. And as I was hearing the devotees present, it was so amazing that I was writing throughout all of my notes and covering everything that I was supposed to speak about without any boundaries because I was so captivated by everything that you're sharing. So thank you so much. It was so wonderful. So boundaries, what are boundaries? First, there's a conception that relationships, especially spousal relationships or marital relationships, there shouldn't be any boundaries. There shouldn't be boundaries. You're one. At the same time, we find that that's not necessarily so. It's not necessarily true. So first of all, what are boundaries? Well, within the context of marriage, we can think of boundaries as the limit that we set that protects the sacredness of our marital relationship. And then having clear, and I reiterate, clear boundaries. This is an essential way for having a healthy and balanced lifestyle, as well as healthy spiritual growth. And so what are some of the misconceptions around boundaries? Well, sometimes we find that one conception about, or misconception about boundaries, is that when you set boundaries, then you are being mean. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're being mean. Or what is another misconception? That you'll be labeled as rigid or selfish, or setting limits. The contrary of being mean is setting the limits and expectation. It actually means that you're not being nice, and we want to be nice. When in actuality, setting boundaries really is basically acknowledging those things that you will accept and those things that you won't accept in a relationship. Doesn't mean that you're not being nice, and it doesn't mean that you're being mean. And then some misconception is also that people who set boundaries are actually being controllers. And that's something that that comes up often. Or that one is, if you have a boundary, that's dictating to your spouse what to do and what not to do. So one thing we understand about boundaries is that even though we may have misconceptions, we may have an understanding that boundaries shouldn't be in the relationships, we all have boundaries. And whether we acknowledge those or are aware of those, that's another story. And so, therefore, if we aren't aware of the boundaries, we tend to act out in our relationships in ways that are considered to be unhealthy. Mm. And also, as we grow in our relationships, these boundaries change as our trust increases with each other. So another point that we want to make in regards to boundaries, one of the main reasons why we don't set boundaries is basically fear. And that's fear, as we talked about earlier, of being mean or not being seen as nice, or fear of feeling guilty, or fear, just being scared, just outright scared. This is uncharted territory. This is something that we're unfamiliar with. It's a new experience. And so we must remember that setting boundaries is a new experience, especially for ourselves. And so one thing that Kanta Bhakti was actually expressing about Yadanath Prabhu, which is one important point to understand when setting boundaries, is we must be clear on what is our intention. What is our intention? And so when we set our boundaries in the relationship, we understand that our intention is to protect the sacredness of the marriage. And so therefore, if our heart is in the right place, and yes, if our heart is in the right place, and that leaves us open to practice the 4 tips that we would like to share with you.
Yay. So, yeah.
So the 4 tips. What are the 4 tips as far as setting boundaries? The first tip, that's awareness. I think that Uttama was showing this wonderful equalizer. I would like to have the equalizer, by the way.
You're out. That's
and so the first thing on her equalizer in a healthy relationship was knowledge. So this first tip that we're giving is synonymous with her point. The awareness, having a knowledge of areas in which we have boundaries, and these boundaries are based upon the needs or feelings that we actually have. We talked about, this fear that comes up, this feeling of feeling guilty. Well, this feeling of guilt comes because we have a need of harmony in the relationship. So we don't want to set boundaries because we have this need. And we think that by setting a boundary, it creates a disharmony, or we have the feeling of scared, the uncharted territory we talked about, because we have a need for predictability or ease or peace in the relationship. So having awareness of our feelings and needs and understanding the areas in which boundaries would help in our relationship. And then tip number 2, communicate. Yes, communicate. Communicate your feelings and needs, and as Rajalila was expressing, in an honest and open way. And in this way, we can actually examine and understand how to navigate through the relationship in a healthy way, in a responsible way. And we go on to tip number 3.
Yeah, tip number 3 is to help us to not react. Oftentimes in our relationships, when we don't have clear boundaries and we don't know boundaries and we know something is not proper, we're uncomfortable about something in our relationship. However, we're afraid to approach our mate and says, this is uncomfortable. For example, Ekavira Prabhu and myself, we've been working on this for some time. So as I shared, this is something that it's constant in our building trust with each other. So at a point in our relationship, Ekavira Prabhu, we would have a conversation with each other. And oftentimes I would be doing something other than listening to what he would be saying to me. So I'm really good at multitasking, I think. So I'm doing a lot of different things and he's speaking to me. And then all of a sudden I will hear Ekavira raise his voice, like really raise his voice. And this is not typical, right? But however, he would raise his voice in such a way that it would trigger, again, back to what Chintamani says, some childhood, experiences that this is not proper behavior. This is not proper behavior to raise your voice. You don't raise your voice. And so I would be like, what are you doing? You don't raise your voice at me, And before it used to turn into a whole argument thing until I realized, and we both realized, his need was for me to pay attention in my listening. And my need was to really be proactive, doing many different kinds of activities at the same time while I think I am listening. So how we built that over the years is we of course communicated, as Ekavira Prabhu said, and we agreed. We made an agreement, as Archana talks about, keeping your word, make an agreement. We agreed that he would not raise his voice when he's trying to get me to listen, and I would stop everything and just turn to Ekavira and give him my full presence and listen to him. And that satisfied him, and I got satisfied. Raising a voice, years we haven't had that. Totally, we have our boundaries, totally. So we've got to, so the third tip, take responsibility for your choice and your needs. Take responsibility. So instead of blaming your partner for how you might feel, for what's happening, ask yourself, how are your choices, purposefully or accidentally, may have contributed to the situation? So for me, accidentally, I thought multitasking is a great thing. It's not. Not when your husband's, his need is for you to give full presence and attention. So we needed to learn that boundary. And the last one we want to share with you as tips is just express your feelings as belonging to you. Again, without blaming your partner, express your feelings without blaming. And so I remember reiterating to my husband, the reason that feeling was coming up for me of being really annoyed and disturbed and angry when he raised his voice was because I was brought up as a child that you don't raise your voice in communicating with others. It's just not an option to raise your voice. That was just how I was brought up as a child. And so it is better to say something like, I feel hurt, and I think I am misunderstood, or as opposed to saying, you made me feel whatever, in this case, hurt, because of the way you talk to me. You made me feel hurt because of the way you talk to me. Let's take responsibility and let's express our feelings. I feel hurt because I am misunderstanding that I misunderstood that for you to be able to say, I listen to you means I have to give my whole bodily presence to you, my everything to you. That is your way of understanding that I properly communicated. So basically, these are some of the four tools, the four tips for boundaries. And we wanted to share that so many of the challenges that many Grihasthas face, and even in our Krishna conscious marriages right now, there's so much spousal abuse, so much going on, because there hasn't been that knowledge or understanding of setting boundaries in the very beginning that Uttama and Parta Prabhu teaches couples in the very beginning. We need to understand that. We need to learn about setting our boundaries. Otherwise, spousal abuse will be inevitable because we're two different people. And so we thank you for allowing us to share. Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, accept those things that are favorable and reject those things that are unfavorable. So let's set boundaries for what's unfavorable to our spiritual growth as a couple. Thank you so very much.
Sure.
Haribo.
Vraja, Lila, and Ekavira Prabhu is keeping it real. Thank you so much.
Keep it real.
Yeah, really practical. Thank you.